Welcome and thank you all for coming. This is a very important topic that we're discussing, racism and the Bishop's document. And then Dr. Chris Witt is here. He's the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at Creighton. And he'll be speaking about some reflections in terms of his experience of Omaha, Creighton, some institutional aspects of racism and anecdotes on that, and then I will be presenting on the Bishop's document and talking about that, and then we have time, we have questions and then time for Q&A, but we have an hour and a half, so it's going to go pretty quickly. This is a series, an ongoing series of Theology Matters. It's sponsored by the Graff Chair and St. Pius X Catholic Church. And I'm very grateful for everyone's work at Pius X. Cindy, Colleen, Rosie, I hope I'm not, Father Joe, of course, I hope I'm not missing anyone. So thank you all for your work and assistance on this. We'll get started. I'd like to introduce Dr. Witt. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
All right. Let's see, make sure the microphone's close enough. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So, as was mentioned, I'm Chris Witt, and I'm the Vice Provost for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion here at Creighton. I've been at Creighton almost a year now. I will, coming up, the end of next month will make a year. So that's also, I've been in Omaha here. I got here about a week before I started at Creighton. So, when Todd contacted me about us doing this, I was definitely excited. We actually had a pretty long back and forth because it was a Thursday evening, and my wife is taking some classes for her admin certification, and her classes previous semester were on Thursday night, so I have to be at home with our 19-month-old son. But luckily, her schedule was different for this semester, so I was able to do it. But yeah, we had a lot of emails where I'm like, look, man, don't count me out, but I'm not sure. And I love all of y'all, but I don't know if I was going to pay for a babysitter to come talk to y'all. Like, maybe I just tape it. You can watch it later. But in any case, so she's home with little man, and I'm here with you all. But when it comes to talking about particularly systemic racism, institutional racism, any elements of marginalization, things like that. Those are things that are near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons. And let me just give you a little bit of a breakdown of me so you understand my perspective. First off, I'm Catholic. So then, if you didn't know, I'm also black. So I'm a black Catholic. And in some parts of the country, being a black Catholic is not really anything that anybody would really bat an eye at, and in other parts of the country it's like I've had how, why and how and why, all of these things, we just don't understand it. Well, I'm from Baltimore, and my mom is originally from New Orleans, so for anybody who kind of knows the history and origins of black Catholics, those are two of the most black Catholic concentrations in the country. So most of my life it wasn't a big deal. It was just, oh, you go to such and such parish, and people just considered it alongside any other black church, whatever else. And then I started moving west into the Midwest, and then people started. I lived in Wisconsin, I lived in Illinois. Now I'm here, and it's wait, you're black and you're Catholic, and how is that a thing? So in any case, I have that dynamic kind of rolling through me. I also have the dynamic that I am a political scientist. My doctoral degree is in political science. Before I came here, in addition to doing diversity and inclusion work, I also was a chair of the Department of Political Science at my previous institution. And my focus within political science is roughly focused on race, wealth, and inequality in American politics. So this stuff we're talking about tonight, this is my passion. So in any case, if I have, in terms of sometimes when you talk to folks in the United States, particularly when you talk to black folks, a lot of times their refuge from a lot of the slings and arrows of systemic racism or day-to-day racism that they may encounter ends up being their church. Well, for me, it was a little bit different because a lot of times when I was dealing with functions, even though there are some majority black Catholic parishes in Baltimore, the parish that I was raised in, baptized in, and everything like that was majority white. And it wasn't that, no one was hateful or anything like that, but you certainly end up dealing with a lot of the same systems that you had in place in your day-to-day life. So I ended up seeing these systems play out over and over again in terms of the dynamics of both power structures as well as various privileges or lacks of privilege. So I was able to see it in kind of all aspects of my life, and I guess that could be for good or for bad. Maybe who I was, but sometimes you need a break. But in any case, when I think of racism, automatically my mind goes to structures. Automatically, my mind goes to situations where people may ask themselves, did what just happen because of race? Did it happen for something else? But they have to factor in, was it race? I don't automatically have my mind go to burning crosses, to racial epithets. Not to say that my mind never goes there, not to say that that's not part of our history, but as a black man in America, with advanced degrees, with a successful career, all of those things, and also someone who studies this, my mind goes to those structures. My mind goes to the structures that people may end up having to face no matter what their status, no matter what their title, no matter what their degree, their income level, whatever it may be. Those structures are strong. Those structures, in terms of keeping people, quote unquote, in the place that many, many generations ago somebody felt they should be due to their identity, be it their racial identity, and we can even go beyond racism when we start talking about the intersections of identity, race, gender, sexuality, and on and on and on. But tonight we're focusing on race. But we have racial structures and racial hierarchies here in the United States. It's nothing that we need to have as, oh, let's pick out people in the audience. You need to feel bad about this. No, we don't need to feel bad about it, but we need to feel about it. We need to recognize that these structures are here. We need to recognize that it's our job not to fix it fully, but to do our part in trying to fix these structures, make them better for the next generation. We want to be a generation that says, well, we started here. And yes, we had racism, sexism, all of the isms. We had exclusion, marginalization, all of those things baked into our structures, baked into our culture, baked into our society. We didn't fix it. We didn't make everybody love. We didn't make everybody walk the walk of Jesus. But by the time we're finished being a generation, by the time we're finished being in this country, on this earth, I would hope that then we could say, well, in our time, we worked to make it better. As opposed to saying, hey, and you hear these conversations on a regular basis. Are we moving backwards? Are we moving backwards when it comes to race? Are we moving backwards when it comes to power dynamics? Are we moving backwards when it comes to wealth distribution and the power of the wealthy versus the power of people with no wealth? Where are we there? And particularly for the folks in the room who are Catholic, the people in the room who really subscribe to Catholic social teachings, we should be driven, that it should be part of what we do, part of when we pray, part of when we act, part of every way that we interact with the society around us, that we consider, what are we doing to make this better? That we consider, are these structures there? And when people who fall into groups who have been marginalized due to either one element of their identity or various elements of their identity that intersect to make them who they are, when they speak and they say the system or the way in which people treat us within the system needs to be better, it needs to be fixed. Instead of using our energy to question them, to doubt them, to always say, well, wait, are you sure? Use a little bit more of our energy to listen, to empathize with them, to think about them in terms of respecting and honoring their humanity. Far too often, in this system that was set up to keep us separate, and at various points to keep us separate due to various elements of identity, if it's ethnicity. If we look in various cities, why might there be so many Catholic churches in a city? Well, a lot of times, you had dioceses that would say, well, this is going to be the Polish church, this will be the Irish church, this will be the German church. And then we go down the street on 24th, and some people may know the story of St. Benedict's, that there was no place that black Catholics were allowed to worship, so then St. Benedict's came about. But that's why in a lot of cities where we have a significant Catholic population, we have so many churches, even if they're in operation or not, but they're physically so close to one another, because we have to own up to the fact that even though we love our church and we love God and all of those things, religion is an action of us as people. And there are moments that bad decisions may have been made in our past that said, all right, we're going to have these divisions. And some people will say, well, those divisions at a certain point made sense because people were talking in different languages and they were doing this and doing that. I recognize that, but let's be real. There were also reasons why people were divided, particularly in the case of St. Benedict's or other things like that. But we have to take a moment to say, let's recognize that history, recognize the legacies of those histories that we still live with, and recognize the fact that there's no way that we have a country that was founded on elements of slavery, elements of, doing what was done to Native Americans, of exclusion of women, of exclusion of so many different folks, and then say, well, all of a sudden, in the last, 20, 30, 40 years, we fixed it all. Things don't work like that. So whenever I teach Intro to American Government, one of the tenets that I have that flows through teaching a course like that is the idea that I try to get the students on board that the United States of America, while it may be great, it may be wonderful, lots of good things have come out, it's also a country that was built on exclusion. And a lot of our big institutions, countries, places, churches, you see that the history is a history of exclusion. And when we end up making progress is when we chip away at that exclusion. When we chip away to make sure that more people have a voice. So it's not an indictment of our country as an institution or of our church as an institution or anything else. It's just actually turning the light on and saying, yeah, this was founded on exclusion, but it hasn't had to stay like that. It's something that we need to celebrate. That we have moved forward as a country. We have moved forward as a church. That we have chipped away at that exclusion and we've worked to make more welcoming and inclusive places. Now, the progress isn't a steady line. It's a zig and a zag. We make some progress, we fall back. We make some progress, we fall back. But what we need to think about is in the grand scheme of things, are we continuing to make that progress? Now, we have to understand that our lives are finite. So we can't expect people to say, all right, talking to somebody who's facing, be it institutional racism on a day-to-day basis, feelings of doubt, where they don't know if they're dealing with the issue of institutional racism, but it's something that is putting a weight on them, and they're basically having to use some of their energy to navigate as a person from an excluded group within some majority group, be it at work, be it in their church, in their community. We can't tell that person, well, let me tell you about the 400-year history of the United States. And let me tell you, friend, we're doing so much better than we were doing 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And they're like, look, God's only going to let me be on this earth for, 80, 90, however many years it's going to be. So I really can't worry about 400 years ago. What are we going to be able to do in the next few months? What are we going to be able to do in the next few years? What are we going to be able to do to make sure that my kids don't have to live some of the things that I lived? That's the type of thing that we have to remember, that there's one thing to be patient, it's another thing to be persistent, but we have to have both of those. We have too much patience with no persistence, you're going to lose a lot of folks. And if you're all persistence and no patience, then you're going to lose folks because they think everything has to happen instantly. But there are those moments where I step away from all of these things, and I step away from doing the work that I do as a vice provost. I step away from my history as a political science professor. I step away from even being a black Catholic, being an American, whatever else. And I just step into the shoes of being a black man in America. Not a black American in this context, what I'm thinking about. Just being a black man existing in America. And I strip away all the degrees, the titles, accolades, all that, and just think about it. Not only being a black man in America, but being a black man raising a black boy in America. And I had a conversation with Todd the other day, and we were talking about structures. We were talking about, hey, what part do you want to talk about? We're going to have the bishop's letter. We're going to do all that. And then the conversation just kind of turned to just a guy-to-guy conversation. And I talked to him about, well, I want to cover these certain things. But then I started talking to him about the fact that over the last, I guess, 2 months, something that keeps jumping back into my head is something that was a quick blurb in the news, but it stuck with me. Shortly after Governor Ricketts was reelected, there started to be talk about he really was in favor of bringing stand your ground legislation to Nebraska. Now, I don't want to turn this into, a political diatribe or anything like that, but I bring that up to say that stuck with me. And it didn't stick with me on an academic level. It didn't stick with me on I'm the diversity and inclusion guy level. It stuck with me as a black man in America, raising a black boy who I hope lives to be a black man. And the reason that it stuck with me is that the states where we have stand your ground legislation, we see that it has been used in many cases to basically get people off the hook when there has been a killing of a black person. And a few times when a black person or a person of color has tried to use it as a defense, it has not worked out for them. And it made me start to think, when you have that type of situation, and this is just an example of many types of examples, what does that mean for me in terms of the value of my life? What does that mean in terms of, what if I just as a man was taken away and my son didn't have me to be there to raise him? And then he got to a certain age and he realized the whole story. And let's say somebody did away with me and they didn't stand, no justice came upon them. And somebody would have to explain to him that his father was gone and nobody really served time. There was no real justice because there were loopholes, because there was a system in place and there were traditions that were passed down that in many cases the way they played out was devaluing of his father's life because of who his father was, his father's identity. Because in that moment when something like that would happen, it wouldn't be Dr. Witt was being killed. It would just be a black dude was killed, and he must have did something. And who knows, if I was the victim, would I be treated the way that so many black victims are treated, where in the media they're brought up on trial? And instead of just being this person was gunned down, it's, well, wait a minute, 5 years ago, did they have a Facebook post where they had a drink in their hand or they smoked weed or whatever it would be? As opposed to, here's the victim, now let's find out what's going on with the perpetrator and figure out how we get to justice. Would my name be dragged through the mud? And then even worse, as a black man in America, raising a black boy to be a black man hopefully one day, I sit there and I take all the academics away and I think about, God forbid, what if that happened to my son? What if my son didn't get to be a teenager? What if my son didn't get to be a man? What if my son didn't get to have a son of his own? Not because he did something wrong, but because somebody didn't see his humanity. Somebody didn't value him as a person. Somebody didn't value him, and they put in place mechanisms where people feel like, maybe I can get away with this. And then they do it, and they do get away with it. What if that would happen? Far too often, I shouldn't say too often, but very often, when we're with my son, everybody loves my son. Oh, look at him. He's so cute. He has the curliest hair. Oh, look at him. Oh, he's so wonderful. And part of me loves it. I love that everybody loves my son. But as a black man in America, I've been around and I've seen a lot. And I've had things said to me, done to me, and I know the structures and I know the history. I always end up having conversations, not all the time, but from time to time I have conversations with my wife about, well, when will this end? When will he not be the cute little boy with the curly hair? When will he become that black boy? When will he become that threat? When will he become that he's still a boy, but people see him as a man earlier than they should be? When will I have to strip away a certain part of his childhood and his humanity to make sure he makes it to manhood? When will I have to have conversations with him earlier than I should have with him and explain to him political concepts and systems and racial justice and racial violence and all of these things that my white counterparts may never have conversations with their kids on, or they may decide to have it when their children are adults and they can have a real conversation. What age do I have to strip away? People talk about, well, when are you going to let them know about Santa Claus and stuff? We haven't even decided if he's going to believe in Santa Claus in the first place. Because we have bigger things on our mind. Well, when are we going to strip away his childhood to say, these are the ways that you're going to survive? Because you are a black boy in America who is growing into a black man in America, and for far too often, wrongly, black males and black people in general are looked at as a threat in America. That's systemic racism. When I have to strip away part of my child's childhood because I want him to live, I have to tell him about these things, and I have to tell him that it could be people who are members of his same faith, his same church. It could be people who are members of the same political party of his parents. It could be people who are neighbors. We don't know who it may be. But I have to tell him, I don't want to make him jaded. I don't want to make him into somebody who doesn't like folks for no good reason, but I want him to be protected. And right now, he's small and he's precious, and we just love him so much. But we see other people's sons being taken away from them. And we see people's childhoods being taken away from them. I've had conversations with colleagues as a professor, as a full-grown adult, where I didn't even realize that parts of my childhood were taken away from me earlier than they should have been until I'm engaging in a conversation over lunch in my 30s as a professor. And I'm talking about when me and my friends, when we got licenses to drive, and I'm like, oh yeah, you know, we used to have, they give us speeches about, well, don't drive here, don't drive there, and oh, well, now that you're old enough to go see family and friends in Philadelphia, because I grew up in Baltimore, they said, well, make sure that you gas up by this exit, because there are a number of exits there that we don't want you to get off at. Because at that time, the Grand Wizard of the National Ku Klux Klan lived between Baltimore and Philadelphia. As much as we think about the South, it was right there, and they had rebel flags along the highway, and they said, well, we don't want you to get off there. We're scared if you get pulled over by the state troopers, all of these different lessons. Put your hands here and do this and do that. And little did I know at the time that that was something that was specific for me in this system as a black boy becoming a black man in America. But becoming a black man in America is more sooner than I should have been. This is institutional racism. These types of things that make us as parents, as spouses to one another, use up energy, use up prayers, use up our cosmic energy, whatever it wants to be, but to use that energy and that time to worry about one another, to actually worry about taking away that childhood from somebody, to think about, to look at my son, this precious little baby, and say, will people feel the same way in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? You know, as he grows and gets bigger and all of those things. So those are the types of things where we strip away all the other things that I do, and that's what really hits me in the heart. And that's why I do the work that I do. The work that I do as a vice provost of institutional diversity and inclusion, because on a daily basis, I can connect with structures. And I'm in a place where at a university, a major Jesuit Catholic university, I have on my shoulders the weight to really guide our culture, to work collectively with colleagues and students and people across the institution to say, what can we do to undo at least little bits of this, to open up doors of opportunity, not just doors of opportunity for people who've been marginalized, and people of color, and people who aren't here or haven't been here in significant numbers, but to open up doors of opportunity to free the people who are in the majority. How many people have ever heard of Du Bois's his piece, The Souls of Black Folk? A few people. Well, I have this concept I always toss around in my head, that this work in diversity and inclusion is as much about the people in the majority, white folks at a lot of these institutions as it is, or if not more, about them than it is about the people who are on the margins. I think about it as the souls of white folk. Because I remember being in Mass a few years ago, and the homily was all about this idea of the weight that people hold. The whole idea, and I'm going to butcher the story, but the idea of, how hard it is for the rich man to get into heaven, like the camel passing through the eye of a needle and all of those things. And a lot of times if you have a system that's built with privilege and the structures are there and people know it or they don't know it, if they don't really recognize it or they don't want to recognize it, and you have people who are suffering and people are not recognizing that, hey, there's certain privileges that are coming at the cost of other people who are suffering. The people who have whatever privilege it may be, a privilege of being in the majority, to have access, whatever it may be, it could be hurting their souls. Their souls could be getting hurt just as much, if not more, than the people who are being marginalized. So when I think about engaging in this work, I think about engaging in work that really can help everybody. I had a few people, particularly when I was new in the job, where they had this concept that I was brought in to kind of be the voice of or the voice for the people who were in the minorities at Creighton. And I was like, no, actually, I'm brought in to be a voice, I guess, of the conscious of the entire university. That none of this work gets done right if we don't do it collectively. And none of this work can get done correctly if we don't just do it collectively within institutions, but if we do it between institutions and do it in partnership with the community. So if we're not engaged in conversation, real conversation about the ills and the pains of racism and sexism and all of the isms and exclusions that we have baked into our society and baked into our interactions, and we're not really taking the time to say, hey, we're not going to fix it all, because that can be overwhelming and you can be crushed under the pressure. But we're going to do something. We're going to communicate with one another. We're going to try to be better this week than we were last week and better the week after that. If we're willing to do that, and if everybody involved is willing to really recognize that work can be done and progress can be made, then we're doing the work of God. That's where diversity and inclusion plays a small part in undoing this structural racism that we have and these other structures of marginalization and oppression that we find, like I said, in communities and government and policy, in the way that we talk about things in broader media, within our church structures, whatever it may be. So that's where we really engage in conversation, but we take it to a higher level. That we don't have all of our conversation be about, that's racist, that's not racist, what word did you say, why did you say that word, all of that. Okay, there's a time and a place for that. But at the end of the day, families are hurting when they don't get a home loan because of their race or their ethnicity. Families are hurting when the breadwinner in the household works their butt off, and for reasons that they don't fully understand, they're passed over. Is it because of their gender? Is it because of their race? Families are hurt when they have to have those conversations with their children earlier than they should for that child's survival. That's what I care about more than a burning cross or than, a racial epithet on the wall. Not to say that that doesn't matter, but day to day, people are dealing with these other things that they chip away at their humanity. I talked earlier about this idea of chipping away at exclusion. When we don't chip away at exclusion, chipping happens. And chipping away at the humanity of the people who are marginalized, but also the humanity is stripped away and chipped away from the people who are in the majority, who are benefiting and don't want to own up to the fact that we have systems in place that hurt folks. So none of us win. This isn't a zero-sum game. This isn't something where, if we do away with racism, then all of a sudden, somebody else is in the driver's seat. Yeah, on the surface, if we do away with racism and systemic racism, obviously, you're going to have a little bit more competition in the job market. You're going to have a little bit more competition in the housing market. But this is bigger than that. This is about souls. This is about people's consciousness. And if we don't do away with this scourge, then we all hurt in the long run. So I have pontificated quite enough. I could go on forever and ever, but I will stop because I'm looking at the clock and I think my turn is up. So I will talk again with you in a moment.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. I think you did an excellent job of identifying structural sin or systemic racism and how it impacts how those who are affected negatively by it, but also those who benefit from it in terms of their own identity, their own perception, their own souls in a way. You're much more political or diplomatic politically than I will be, but this is a very timely, unfortunate, timely issue. Tonight I was watching the news before I came, and Steve King was on the news, and he made a statement, where did white supremacy get its negative connotation? And white nationalism. I think we're experiencing a peak of the history that we've tried to move away from, very unfortunately, with politically, culturally, in terms of this divide that we're facing in the church and also society. Another just anecdote before we get started. Several years ago when John Paul II came to St. Louis, he gave a talk, and in that talk he talked about the evils of abortion, euthanasia, and racism. And after the talk, a commentator from EWTN came on, and they said, well, it was a very powerful talk, it was very informative and very inspirational, but the Pope was misinformed on the issue of racism. Racism is no longer an issue in the United States. And that was someone, yeah, exactly. That was someone representing the church in that commentary, and you think, my God, that's we'll talk about that, but that's the schistosis or blind spot about racism and how it has penetrated the very soil of American society and culture. Okay. All right. I'm going to go through this. There's a lot here. The bishops issued a document on racism. It's a very important document. It's a relevant document, but it also has some shortcomings. So I want to start first of all with a distinction, an important distinction between catechesis and theology. And I usually start my presentations this way because there are some controversial issues all the time. So catechesis is presenting church teaching, for instance, the bishop's document on racism, the history behind it, the understanding of it, etc. Theology is critically reflecting on catechesis. And so the title of this talk is Theology Matters, not Catechesis Matters. All right? So just so we're clear there. So there will be some critique of the document as well. Just a brief historical overview of Catholic teaching on racism, an important distinction, race versus ethnicity. So race refers to a person's physical characteristics, such as bone structure, skin, hair, eye color, etc. Ethnicity refers to cultural factors, including nationality, regional culture, ancestry, and language. You can have racism that applies to race or racism that targets ethnicity. Both you find, but it's an important distinction. Racism is often based on the physical characteristics of a person. African American, Hispanics, Eastern Asians, etc. Discrimination, there's a history of documents that the bishops have issued over the last 40, 50 years. One is discrimination in the Christian conscience, which condemned blatant racism and segregation and Jim Crow laws. The national race crisis in 1968 condemned the scandal of racism, the policies and actions that led to the race riots. Brothers and sisters to us. Now, this is subtle, but we find it in the current document as well. Who is the us and who is the them? I mean, that's subtle in a way, but it's not, okay? And it sort of highlights the division between us, and we're called to love them, right? And them aren't part of us. That sort of diversity and polarization that we sometimes find in the church. And this will come back to that systemic racism or structural racism. This isn't intentional. Nobody who wrote this document is racist per se, but they're just insensitive to language and how that language, the perception that that gives in terms of different groups. Okay, so that looked at the structural and institutional forms of racial injustice evident in economic imbalances, etc. Recent bishop statements, for instance, Archbishop Alfred Hughes is actually has an important document, and in that he talks about racism, which involves not only individual prejudice, but also the use of religious, social, political, economic, or historical power, as Chris pointed out, to keep one race privileged. That's a pretty insightful statement, I think, and a helpful statement naming the idea of racism and the structures. So what I want to do, this is a long document, it's 30-some pages. We're not going to go through it in detail, but I want to touch on some important aspects. And then we'll open it up with some questions and let you have some discussion and then some Q&A. So first of all, the document begins, what is racism? So racism arises when, and the words that are highlighted we're going to go through and sort of deconstruct and explain. Racism arises when either consciously or unconsciously a person holds that his or her own race or ethnicity is superior and therefore judges persons of other races or ethnicities as inferior and unworthy of equal regard. When this conviction or attitude leads individuals or groups to exclude, ridicule, mistreat, or unjustly discriminate against persons on the basis of their race or ethnicity, it's sinful. Racist acts are sinful because they violate justice. They reveal a failure to acknowledge the human dignity, going back to Chris, of the persons offended, to recognize them as the neighbors Christ calls us to love. Okay, so let's go through and unpack some of the aspects or phrases in that document. First of all, the persistence of racism is why we are writing this letter now, the bishops say. Okay, so it hasn't gone away, it hasn't gotten better in the church per se in some ways it has, but in other ways it hasn't. They refer to racism as our country's original sin. Okay, so first of all, consciously or unconsciously. Who in this room is a racist? Consciously a racist in terms of his or her actions. This was supposed to be an easy question. You guys are educated and too sensitive. So, I mean, too aware, not too sensitive, but too aware. Okay? Know your audience. All right. So consciously, I don't think anyone is doing hate crimes. They're saying racial slurs, racial jokes, all those things that are obviously racist actions. Okay? But unconsciously, we participate in racism in and through privilege oftentimes. It's not conscious, it's unconscious, and the bishops recognize that. To many good and faithful Catholics, remain unaware of the connection between institutional racism and the continued erosion of the sanctity of life. Okay? That's an important distinction. It's often unconscious. People try to treat other people with respect, dignity, etc. But oftentimes, by our very participation in reality, we're privileged as male, white especially, and so race comes into play and gender comes into play, where people aren't privileged and don't benefit just by their gender and just by their race. Schistosis is a reason for this. What Mike and I have written about quite a bit, schistosis is a moral blind spot. Schistosis represses from consciousness a scheme that would suggest an unwanted insight, preventing the emergence into consciousness of perspectives that would give rise to unwanted insights. So racism and white privilege. People often don't recognize this. Now, my theological hat, in terms of the bishop's statement, there's no mention of white privilege in the entire document. And that's such a foundational insight. There's much mention of structural sin, but there's really, it often comes back to individual racist acts. And that's not real helpful. Because if we say, well, I'm not racist, I'm not mean to people because they're black or because they're Hispanic, I treat people with respect, that kind of misses the point about how insidious the systems and structures can be that perpetuate racism, right? It's one thing if you know a person's racist and say you're a jerk and don't deal with them, but people that don't think of themselves as racist or benefiting from the system that is racist, that's more difficult nut to crack, right? And so that has to be the focus in a way of addressing this issue of racism. Sinful, okay? The document talks about being sinful. Well, individuals or groups. It's important to understand divisions in Catholic theology when it comes to sin. So the personal sin of racism, racist acts, attitudes, motives, etc., can be divided into sins of commission, hate crimes, racial slurs, demeaning attitudes, etc., or sins typically and more commonly of omission. And the document talks about this when individuals, communities, and even churches remain silent and fail to act against racial injustice when it is encountered. So it's not doing something when we should be active in addressing this. And some of the alt-right movements we've seen, where are the bishop's voices in that? I mean, we have to name these things and say, okay, who's speaking out? Who's addressing these things and saying this is wrong? Who is naming people? I mean, politically, regardless of where you stand on Trump, when he talks about shithole countries, that's not a morally neutral statement, right? Where are the outspoken condemnations of that type of language, that type of attitude? We'll see what happens with Steve King, and if someone calls him to task. But I think that's problematic. We've come to such a point where we're not necessarily comfortable with these things, but we accept them, right? As a culture, as a society, that's part of the politicized and polarized reality we're in. The structural sin of racism is the cumulative effects. Personal sins of racism have led to social structures of injustice and violence that makes us all accomplices in racism. That's the unconscious dimension. By the very fact that we benefit from those structures, we're participating in it. It may not be simple, and oftentimes it's not. But part of the idea behind schistosis is that we need to become aware of these realities in order to confront them. There's a Jesuit principle, I'll get to that, but faith that does justice is foundational principle. I think it's a very powerful principle, but what's lacking, and what Mike and I have written about, is that you have to see injustice in order to do justice. And part of that requires becoming educated and overcoming those moral blind spots. With knowledge comes responsibility and power in a way. Okay? So let's look briefly at 3 examples of systemic racism and schizosis that often involves that. So first of all, economic. Let's look at this just a minute and see what's going on here. Okay, so Asian at the top of the ladder in terms of earnings, white, and then all races, but you have Hispanic, and then at the very bottom, black. Okay, and their income has been at the bottom for a very long time, right? What do we do with that? What does that mean? So that's a fact. That's factual knowledge. What does that mean for past, for present, for future in terms of how systemic racism is manifested? This isn't a rhetorical question. What's it mean?
It's a systematic approach to keep black people down.
Okay, it keeps black people down, and that's demonstrated in the earnings. What impact does it have in terms of the present and in terms of the future with black people frequently? How does it impact?
Well, if you have the income gap that's so closely related to the racial wealth gap, in terms of the transmission of wealth from generation to generation. So opportunities cost so much more to put the next generation in a good position that it's hard to catch back up.
Yeah, exactly. This impacts everything, right? Healthcare. I mean, these jobs don't have healthcare, so the mortality rate for African Americans is lower age than for Caucasians, for instance.
I would say that even, and I hope this isn't right, the number of few black people that are given the opportunity to even lift that up a little bit, so that line really doesn't even represent the reality of how bad it actually is.
Yeah, sure. Access, yeah, Cindy.
I was just going to say that I think that black people know this. All of them know it. And I think it completes any sense of hope or future. Why go to school?
Yeah.
I can't get a job anyhow. Or
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of hopelessness and a relating to reality that's shaped by this factual data in terms of savings. The savings oftentimes isn't there in order to have a safety net. There's a vulnerability, living in poverty oftentimes that comes with that. Lack of access to education, lack of access to housing that puts you in neighborhoods oftentimes that are on the lower echelon in terms of opportunity of teachers that will go there and work, in terms of the access to education that impacts future earnings. All of that comes into play, right? So when we talk about economic systemic injustice, it's often tied to race, and poverty and race go hand in hand oftentimes, and it's cyclical oftentimes because of the lack of opportunity, and those are in structures. And there are all sorts of examples of this. I know there's a recent study where they sent out resumes to a bunch of different companies, and they were hypothetical. They just made up people, but they gave some unique names that are often identified with African Americans, and some Joe Smith or John Brown or whatever. And they found that given the same qualifications, those with the unique names didn't get called for an interview. And those with the more standard names, i.e. white, got called for an interview, right? This is the systemic injustice that we're talking about, and the racism. Okay, and then also college degrees. That just gives more information. But this information is important because it demonstrates systemic inequality and racism that privileges some and disadvantages others. And that's what we're talking about with systemic racism. Religious, okay? When you look at that, what's your sense? What's your understanding? Who is God and who is God for? Which do you relate to and why do you relate to this? And it's race as well as gender. God is Father, right? How does that shape how we think about God and how we think about men versus women? We live in a very patriarchal church. Is it any coincidence about how we name God? Is it any coincidence how we think about Mary and Jesus, the baby Jesus, black, white, or brown? How does that impact religiously? What are the symbols? And Brian Massengill will talk about addressing and confronting systemic racism. Even in the church, we need to provide a new hermeneutic or interpretation of symbols and provide different narratives in a way that are inclusive, not exclusive. And something as simple as how Jesus and Mary are pictured is a very powerful image about how we look at reality, how we look at religion, etc. Racism and capital punishment, another issue. And Pope Francis points this out, and this is an important point, and it's not contained in the document. And I think it really demonstrates how the bishops themselves have schizosis in terms of how they think about these issues. So for instance, the bishops teach that racism is an intrinsic evil. But one's position on capital punishment, if we've read in the Catholic Voice, if you read it, is, well, the church teaches it's wrong, but it can be a prudential judgment, right? So in other words, you can decide. Now, it's very interesting because Pope Francis actually changed the teaching. Whereas it was admissible under rare circumstances, now it's inadmissible. I'm curious how they're going to deal with that, okay? But in terms of it being admissible at times, the bishops have also taught that the institution of capital punishment is fundamentally racist, right? So on the one hand, they're saying, well, you can't be racist, but on the other hand, you can, under a prudential judgment, be for capital punishment. You have to have good reasons. Do you see the problem there? There's a disconnect between, on the one hand, the bishops saying, well, you can't be racist, but on the other hand, well, you can be in favor of policies that are racist, right? Thinking holistically about structures. The same is with gender issues and sexual orientation issues. So the church, I hate this phrase, unjust discrimination, which implies what?
There's just discrimination.
That's a problem. And the church uses that when it comes to homosexual people and in terms of gender, right? So in the Nebraska Catholic Conference is on the one hand saying, well, we have to treat people with human dignity and respect, etc., but we can't support legislation that tries to make discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation illegal. Because that's just discrimination, right? That's hugely problematic. Another issue, one of the reasons why we're here tonight is because I've written controversial issues on sexual issues, so I'm not allowed to speak in the Archdiocese. Not even on racism. And yet Pete Ricketts, who is an advocate for capital punishment, for racist policy, and against universal health care, a foundational Catholic social teaching, and against immigration, can be the keynote speaker for a Catholic fundraiser. Okay? Do you see the problem of credibility and the disconnect there? And so I think the bishops have schizosis, we all have it, but we have to acknowledge it and recognize and be open to dialogue with one another and not use power, going back to your point, in order to suppress counter voices, right? Okay. My soapbox. All right. Justice. a third aspect in that definition, recognize the fundamental human dignity of all, which includes legitimate rights. They don't specify these rights, but they're rights and responsibilities that come with justice. The classic definition of justice in Gaudium et Spes and other documents is rendering a person his or her due. Okay, so that fundamental equality, and that's one of the problems with the language of white privilege too. The idea is not that you want to eliminate white privilege, it's that you want to expand privilege to all people, right? It's not that having privilege in society is bad. The bad part is when it's exclusive and those same rights are not extended to all people, and it's race or gender, whatever is used to limit that. Justice is being in right relationship with God, one another, etc. It's tainted by original sin, which causes us to lust to dominate. And that's manifested in racism. Human dignity, another foundational principle in that definition. It's foundational principle of Catholic social teaching. We're all created in God's image and likeness, and we're called to respect that fundamental human dignity of all people. It requires equal and just treatment individually and socially. There's a lack of integration and engagement of Catholic social teaching in the document itself, which is really unfortunate because it is such a rich tradition. So the idea, you have solidarity mentioned once. It's not expanded upon. You don't have any discussion of the preferential option for the poor or the common good even, and that's a lost opportunity. On another note, Brian Maskell, the leading Catholic moral theologian on race in the U.S., wasn't asked by the bishops to participate and be a consultant on this document. And the reason why he wasn't is because he's written controversial things on sexual ethics. Okay, so again, that missed opportunity, especially one who is deeply engaged in this issue from an African American perspective. Responses to racism in the document, genuine conversion of heart. Conversion should be, and this from Lonergan, it should be personal, recognizing our own white male privilege. For instance, with the social analysis, briefly, that we looked at, but educating ourselves on that. Intellectual, understanding reality, people, and structures that support this privilege and being critical of them. Spiritual, faith that sees injustice, and moral does justice, responding through deeds, words, relationships, attitudes, etc. So that conversion, as Chris pointed out, it's an ongoing process. And we try and move in that direction, but the first step is to become educated about what's going on, to name it in order that we can confront it and hopefully transform it. The urgent call to love, walk humbly with God. I'm not going to read all these. If you want access to the PowerPoint, I can get that to you, but for sake of time, I just want to go through these. Acknowledging sin individually, socially, structurally, certainly. Being open to encounter new relationships, working for justice, educating ourselves, working in churches, changing structures. Just briefly, a critical assessment of the document. It lacks a detailed social analysis, and in terms of intellectual conversion, that's really key. There are a few references that talk to about Pew Research and statistics, but it could go in more depth on that. It lacks input from those who are the victims of racism. Focus is on individual acts. Again, it talks about some structures and problems, but it always comes back to repentance and sinful acts that people commit in terms of racism. And that's the conscious dimension. That's really low fruit, right? It's the subconscious or unconscious that really needs to be addressed. Fails to address the depth of structural racism and schistosis. Fails to address and recognize the church's complicity in racism historically. I mean, that was really frustrating. Looking at how it portrayed the African experience, the Hispanic experience, the Native American experience. One, it's not reducible to that, but two, the church had a pretty big role to play in some of that oppression. And I think the church needs to admit that and take responsibility for it. You have allusions to that, but often it's couched in terms of the sons and daughters of the church, not the church itself. And that's a bit disingenuous. That's John Paul II. The church as the bride of Christ can't be sinful, but it's those screwed up people in the church that are messing things up. Well, no, the church is the people of God. The people of God, including everyone, have made mistakes. It lacks passion. How many people in here have heard a homily on racism? Okay, a couple people. How many have heard one on abortion or same-sex marriage? I mean, everyone, I suppose, has probably heard something about that. So part of the emphasis needs to change. I mean, abortion, same-sex marriage, everyone knows what the church teaches on those issues. Most people don't know what the church teaches about racism and the prevalence of racism in terms of our own social structures. Okay. Here's some questions for discussion. I'm going to leave it up to the group to decide what you want to do. You can either discuss some of these among yourselves and we can reconvene, or we can have a Q&A. Bring Chris up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you guys questions. There were some things you said I thought was very provocative, and I'd like to get more clarification if possible.
Sure.
So, I mean, I know we did this for the group, we're doing a small group thing, but there are a lot of stuff that you shared tonight that raises a lot of questions or issues, and I want to throw one out. One, you used a term, you said unconscious racism, or we're not racist, or whatever, and I would argue the point, I say up front, I'm a recovering sexist or recovering homophobe or whatever. I'm throwing this out as an example, and I had a colleague of mine, his white colleague, and she said, yeah, you're homophobic, and I says, well, what are you? She said, I'm not. And I never, basically what I'm trying to say is, who am I to say whether I'm not a sexist or homophobe if I'm doing it? So you just got to alluding to King. King would probably say he's not. So when a white person says to me they're a racist, I'm wondering, how can you actually say that, either consciously or unconsciously? Should that not be the person who would be the victim of that racism or sexism? You follow where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
So in other words, if I come into Scott High School and I see there's only 6 people of color at the school, and there's only, there's a city that's 33% white, people of color, then I raise the question even in this room. What does that say? And am I consciously or unconsciously, as a white person, participating in that? So the question I throw out to you, I know there's a lot of questions, but when we come out of this event tonight, what is your magic wand would get from this? So when I look at this conversation, we had it 25 years ago. So what does that say about us as Catholics or as Christians and someone who grew up in the city? The stories of my grandfather are the same as the stories that I have to share. You follow what I'm saying? So I'm leading to, what is the magic wand we take out tonight? Again, I don't say it disrespectfully, but I'm like, as a professor, as a scholar, what would be your thing that we walk away with today? Because this is all academic unless you translate it, right?
Sure.
So I would love to hear your reactions to, what would you think we should take from this, particularly some of us who don't know what we want to do? And some of us are confused, including me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, Chris.
Which one was a good question?
I'm sure I wouldn't cover everything that you said, but I hear where you're coming from. I think that we have to be very clear that there's, on one hand, we could get hung up on not being racist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very hard to judge, but I'll tell you what's a little bit easier to judge or to measure. Are you anti-racist?
Gotcha.
So I would want people to walk away and say, I'm going to try to do my damnedest to engage in anti-racism. It's a big difference. It becomes an academic question. It becomes something that, hey, I don't get in the classroom as much as I used to, so I need to work the room. I miss it. So, but I would say that, we can spend all day trying to figure out, well, are you recovering racist? Have you been racist? Are you benefiting from the system? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? But it's a lot easier to say, I declare that I'm anti-racist, because then somebody can call you to question. Mm-hmm. They can say, oh, for real? You're anti-racist? Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Anti-Racist, what have you done to be anti-racist today? What have you pointed out to people? What structure have you tried to deconstruct? What way have you tried to make a way for somebody who didn't have that way before? That's something that we could actually take account of. That's something, not that we should be keeping count, hey, at the pearly gates, I was anti-racist 365. No, but I would say in kind of response to your broader idea, that would be something, if you want to have like a magic wand or magic pill to come away from here, that hopefully more people than not would say, I'm going to engage in making, like I had my mentor, used to always, her email address, everything was make a better world. And I think I told you this story before, that there's a number of us who at various points in the last couple years, we've been in different publications and we've alluded to this whole make a better world concept. And now we're all in our 40s, we're administrators, we're nationally known. And it was one of my friends is at UCLA, I'm here, another one of my friends is at a school in South Carolina, and some kind of way we had a meeting. And we were talking about how we were reading different articles where we commented on stuff, and we all still had that concept in us. And she's been dead for years. She told us this, way before there was Obama, any of that stuff. Whatever you guys do, work to make a better world. And we've each played it out a little differently in our careers, but that's the type of general concept that you want people to take away. Not just, I was quiet, I didn't say anything to anybody, I minded my business. No, this isn't about minding your business. This is about doing the business of God. So does that kind of address, at least that would be my, I don't know what you have to say, but that would be my response to what you said.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm so proud to be at Creighton and to teach at Creighton, creating men and women for others and a commitment to justice. And I try and instill that in my students every day, whether or not I'm successful. But I think individually we have the ability to impact one person at a time. As Chris was saying, what have we done to not be a racist today? And so what can you do personally to address the structural sin or the personal sin is to be aware of it, first of all, overcome scetosis of the blind spots, and then to see where you can have an impact, no matter how small that can be. And basically, I was flying Southwest a few days ago, or a few weeks, and the stewardess came on, she said, at the end of the flight, she said, be kind to one another. Be kind to one another. She said it twice, and I thought, what a great message. I mean, she's ministering to people in all sorts of ways of inclusion, respect, dignity. I thought that's a simple way to do it. Demonstrate love in your actions, your words, and your relationships.
Could you back it up one slide? I think I'm looking for number 7. No, 6, apologies. Okay, that's the one. Attend to the formative power. I'm an educator, so I'm wondering, a part of it is speaking up, or, the anti-racist thing we just heard, I suppose, by attending to the formative power. That one caught me.
Yeah, that's Massengale's actually critique of many of the earlier statements. He has an article that he's writing for NCR, a commentary on this document that should come out hopefully in a couple of weeks. But I think he has some good insights there. And the symbols are very powerful too, in terms, it shape our way of looking at reality, looking at ourselves, looking at others. And I think we need to be conscious of that and conscious of language as well.
I'm just thinking of the whole Steve King thing, and it is indefensible. I mean, he's got a history of indefensible statements and positions, but they just reelected him in 2018. I mean, so this means we've got a bigger problem than just
Oh yeah,
Steve
certainly.
King.
And I can guarantee you, a lot of Catholics voted for him.
Are you serious?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, we have a lot of work to do, right?
Just a couple.
You can, Chris, come on up.
Okay.
Don't have to ask twice. Just a couple of comments. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is it's very difficult to address these kinds of structures as an individual. I mean, I can do some individual things, but to come together with a collective of people with a Catholic social teaching team in a church or an OTOC or whatever. And to be able to do that kind of with a group of like-minded people has a lot more impact and is more effective. I just came from a meeting today where some really good social analysis has been done on our city's slumlord problem. Guess what? Guess who are the folks who are living in the slumlord places? They're not me. And it's, I mean, the analysis is just, Rosie, just eye-opening. You can't hear me?
Use the mic.
No.
Is the microphone mobile?
Yeah.
We cannot hear the questions.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You know, I just said that I think it's important for people to do individual things as they can, but it's even more important for people to come together in like-minded groups to work together to address some of these systemic issues. And then I just came from a meeting today where some really incredible social analysis about our city has been done about the slumlord rental properties in our city. Approximately 3/4 of the ones with all of the complaints, with all of the problems, are in the eastern part of the city, North and South Omaha. And we know that's not where I live. And that's not where a lot of us in this room live. But we know that those are the people who are being systemically oppressed. And there are people working on it, so you gotta hope, you gotta hope.
I would say just, I guess a quick response to that and a few other things that was said is that we have to be very, very careful that in getting in rooms of like-minded people, that before we kind of, I guess, stamp things with this is the gospel truth, or before we end up going out into the world and doing things, that there's also that time to get educated and that time to engage in dialogue with a lot of the people with whom we talk about. So, you know, sometimes these numbers, without the full story and without real interaction, they can end up kind of skewing the way people think about things. So, yes, you have, you know, lower income numbers, let's say, for black folks in the United States versus their white counterparts. But to dig a little bit deeper, you have to look at intergenerational wealth. That's where, all right, what systems are in place where people are going to pass wealth from generation to generation? And so that's where you really see even bigger gaps, and you see gaps that aren't in the moment. It's not, well, go get a better job and you'll have wealth. No, wealth doesn't work that way. Wealth is something that's built generation after generation. But the other thing that we have to think about is when we equal things out for education, when we equal things out for income, all of those things, we still end up having wealth gaps because of the structural nature. But even when we even out the wealth side, if you talk to individuals, they still encounter various elements of systemic racism. Because when we don't recognize the fact that, let's say somebody like me, who is a senior leader at a prominent university, making a nice salary with all the degrees, all of that stuff, that I still can identify times where I'm questioning, you know, was this part of the system, was this individually racist, whatever it may be, and where I actually encounter those things, that's where we see just how insidious this is. Because sometimes we can give ourselves an out if we end up conflating poverty and race, and then when racism happens, we can say, because that person's poor because they don't care, they don't do any more. But when you end up seeing people that put it all together and still end up facing that, well, you know that, okay, this is a problem that goes across all of these boundaries. So that was just something that I wanted to throw out there. And the one other thing I wanted to throw out there is you guys bounced around with Steve King and elected officials, and if Catholics or other folks voted for somebody who goes against so many teachings, that's an issue of prioritization. that a lot of times we'll end up having people who they may say, well, you know, I think that racism is a terrible thing, sexism is a terrible thing, exclusion, whatever else, but they have that one thing that trumps everything. Is it going to be abortion? Is it going to be lower taxes? Is it going to be white supremacy that they want to hold on to, even if they don't name it that? If they just say, I like the way things used to be and I don't want to see them change. It could be anything. But they may actually have a desire to see those other things go away, but the desire to hold on to whatever it is that is their priority outweighs that. And that's how we pass it from generation to generation, even among well-minded people. And that's how it's so evil. Because it ends up being something that's like Lord of the Rings, you know, oh my precious. Like they know they're doing wrong, but it's but I have to have, you know, that precious privilege or supremacy or whatever it may be. And you end up seeing a lot of times that one thing or those two things are so important that they actually vote against their own interests. Because somebody was able to fool them into, well, if we do away with, let's say, this social program, that's all the black people getting it. Well, there's not enough black and Latino people in the country to take whatever social program it is that poor rural whites are going to get hurt from. We end up seeing some of the places where the people are the most conservative and the most against various social programs be the places where those federal expenditures are made the most. The Ozarks, all kind of places like that, because they've been fed a lie that all your money that you don't have because you're poor living in a trailer living off the government, you're not paying taxes, but all of that money is going to people in cities and there's just not enough people to make up for it. So that's where those lies and that desire for whatever that one thing is not only can have people vote against or act against their moral compass, it can also have them actually vote against things that would benefit them, their families, their kids, whomever else. So that's just my two kind of long-winded responses to a few points that were bouncing around. So, and I'll roll out with the mic, so I'm going to go to the back and come to the front. I got you. You chill.
I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say that my impression of a manifestation of an action, be it in this sense collective, is we've been at St. Pius a little over a year, and the thing that struck me when I first got there, besides Mike's personality as our pastor, you know, just outgoing and effusive, was this statement that was written on white butcher block paper that was in the window in the back. And I was drawn to that. I've never seen anything as Methodist or inclusive in a Catholic church, but in public. Then, 5 months later, it showed up on hardboard in bright blue 2-inch letters on top of the glass case in the back. That's a hell of a statement for a group to make. In this sense, a church of the Catholic Church or a parish of the Catholic Church. And we have to remember that our bishop is invited there, or if we had a surrogate bishop, every year to do confirmation. They get to see it. Now, if we have that stated, how do we live it? And many of you are activists in the room doing all kinds of little things. But it's a pretty damn powerful statement to put that on the wall and to say that to anybody who walks into our church. And if there's anything that this parish should celebrate, it's making the statement, and then in each way we can, individually or by group, live it. You can't do it all perhaps, but you can do your piece, your part, your voice, your strength. To me, that's the power that this parish could do even more of. We posted it. Now you got to live it in ways that other people feel it. And if this kind of meeting could give voice to it, or other meetings, I'd like Pius to be known as that's a bastion of social justice in this city.
It's right there.
So anyway, just a promo for Pius.
All right, while I'm looking for the next person, I did want to make a quick mention. I love the name of your church because I was married and baptized my son at St. Pius in Rock Island, Illinois. So I need to come check out the St. Pius here. So who was next?
All are welcome.
Okay.
So My question is to both of you separately, and I think it touches on what you were speaking about an issue of prioritization for voters, and also I think you alluded to for the church in terms of maybe abortion or same-sex marriage and being against that takes precedence over being anti-racist. So with that in mind, what is the intended purpose in your estimation of this bishop's letter if it didn't go far enough according to your critique? Who is the audience and what's the movement forward from the church on the issue of racism? And then from a Creighton perspective, how do you see Creighton from a Catholic lens maybe taking from this document and pushing forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think in terms of the bishops, I think they're aware of this polarization and a sort of resurgence of the racist alt-right, not only in the States, but in Europe and around the world as well, which is really unfortunate. And unfortunately, more so, they're looking to the States as a role model for how to implement that. And so I think they see a need to combat that explicitly. Now, in terms of moving forward, we'll see. I mean, I'd love to see the bishop issue a statement that is required to be read at every Mass, like it has on abortion, like it has on same-sex marriage. I think racism, in fact, I mean, as bad as abortion is in many ways, racism is more insidious because it's not something you can always name, and in a way that you can with abortion. Also, just another point that kind of goes back to your point, Chris, in terms of education and power structures and people voting against their own interests. I mean, all the evidence is there. In Democratic-led administrations, abortion has dropped more than in Republican administrations. The evidence is there. It's documented. Okay? So when we're talking about single voter issues and life issues, what is the real pro-life policy? And people are co-opted by this simplistic view of a very complex issue, religiously, economically, morally, etc., and reduce it to the one issue of abortion, pro-life. Well, it's not that simple, and the evidence illustrates it's not that simple. And so people, it comes back to being informed, I think, on many of these issues.
Well, I think that when we talk about people really having a broader perspective, it's one of those things, even when you bring up the pro-life perspective, there's so many ways to really engage in being pro-life that go beyond simply looking at legislation on if something's allowed or not allowed. In terms of, okay, we want more children to be born, we don't want those pregnancies to stop, then we need to support the mothers. We need to make sure that all children who are born into this world are born into a world where they're loved, regardless of their race or their ethnicity. That they're supported, that families are supported, all of those things. And then that kind of brings it away from, you can have debate in terms of, the specifics over there of, let's say, an abortion policy. But when you talk about pro-life in general, when we talk about pro-life from, birth to death, in terms of really making sure that we're protecting life, we want to protect the lives of people who lose their life at the hands of law enforcement. We want to protect the lives of people who lose their lives at the hands of fellow citizens. We want to protect the lives of people who their lives are basically devalued because of the family or the neighborhood they're born into, their race, whatever else. I mean, so there are things that are going on that are hyper-political, that are connected to the church, that if we really ascribe the church's real beliefs, we really ascribe Catholic social teachings, that we could take it in a different way, and it really could play a big role in undoing or being anti-racist, because we're doing away with structures of division and marginalization. So that would just kind of be my additive to that. You asked the question of a little bit more focused on Creighton. Well, I would say if Creighton wants to be a leader, and right now we're engaged in a whole lot of benchmarking in terms of diversity and inclusion efforts at other Jesuit institutions throughout North America, as well as other Catholic institutions and other institutions in general. And on one hand, I'm not going to lie, you know, Creighton is not the leader, not the cutting edge, none of those things. But at the same time, the ones that are the leaders that are out there, they're not that, you know, they're not that far out. You know, it's not like, oh, wow, they're really breaking ground. So Creighton can certainly catch up to the pack and then find some ways in which we can actually step out from the pack. Some of the ways that we can do that is we're supremely Jesuit compared to other Jesuit institutions in terms of the number of Jesuits who are here, the fact that we participate so much in the formation of Jesuits, the fact that we really ascribe to that Jesuit mission, and if we're really going to ascribe to that mission, then we have to see the humanity and value in each and every person. If that person is officially connected to Creighton, or if they're simply physically our neighbor. So that's where we're starting to talk through how are we going to be better neighbors in terms of really working shoulder to shoulder with our neighbors, the people who are in this place, versus saying, okay, we're going to engage in charity. No, there are things that we bring to the table, there are things that neighbors bring to the table, and how do we look at each other equally? Those are the types of things that we can do. We can engage in building leaders who will go out into the world and actually see value in people and know how to talk to people who are different than them. I can't snap my fingers and all of a sudden have a supremely diverse student body. I can't snap my fingers and have our workforce just automatically be diverse, but we can work on having a much more welcoming and inclusive and proactive and really thoughtful and mindful environment where we're always trying to be a little bit better, where people would actually desire to be here. I always say, whenever I'm going around the university, I say, you know, a lot of times when we talk about diversity and inclusion, particularly when it comes to our potential students, unfortunately, the conversation ends up becoming a conflation of race and poverty and high need and first generation. Yes, we're in the United States. There are disparities. There's going to be more families of color that are sending students to school who are going to be first gen. There's going to be more families of color that are going to have less financial means. But guess what? There are also significant numbers, particularly when you think about the numbers that would be needed to bring some diversity to a school where the diversity numbers are pretty low. There are families who are writing checks. They're just not writing checks to Creighton. They're writing checks somewhere. They have generations of college degrees in their families and their families of color, but they're saying, well, do I want to go to the place that's working on it, or do I want to go to a place that has at least figured out enough that I feel comfortable writing this check, that I can Google the senior leadership at the institution and at least see a few people, you know, who are from different backgrounds, that I can look at the faculty that my child will be dealing with and see a few people who look like us, that I know some of that history. So we have some work to do. But we want to be a place that people who have the option not to come here, and they're coming from various marginalized groups, they say, well, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to write the check. It's not to say nobody's coming here, but hopefully everybody understands what I'm saying. And that's the same thing when we talk about a community, a parish, whatever it will be, that you want to make yourself welcoming and you want to show people that you're genuine. So when they have the option, they at least explore the option to join in. As opposed to saying, well, you need to be here because I said so, and if you don't do it, you're wrong. Well, then we're pretty much kind of perpetuating supremacy in that way. So that would be kind of a Creighton perspective on it. Sangeeta, I saw your hand, and then we could come to the front. She had her hand up for a while.
First of all, thank you, gentlemen, for this presentation. It has been very thought-provoking. So I'm a social worker and work out of the counseling center here on campus. And one thing that you said, Chris, about like we can't focus on the bigger issues sometimes because that can bring us down, and how we need to kind of figure out what's like another step we can put in front of each other. And at first I started thinking about, you know, what's the brick we can put in the wall, and then I thought, no, that's not a good example right now. So what's a stone we can lay on the bridge or something?
Yeah, there you go.
But you know, yeah, but one of the things I guess that I encounter, I think maybe others in this room, whether you're dealing with students or family or community members, is it's really, you know, it's easy to call people racist. It's harder to understand that perspective and harder to understand where a person is coming from. And I encounter a lot of really hurt, painful, vulnerable students who have felt the evilness of racism. They felt that here on this campus. And that breaks my heart as a person of color, but also just wanting to help them. And so my question, I guess, to both of you is, how do we help students start these conversations? You know, what are some tools to help them understand that it's not just about pointing fingers, it's not just about saying, I'm only hanging out with people who believe what I believe and that's it, but how do we help people to get to an understanding? And I know this is like hugely unpacked, but if there's a few things you can think of conversation starters to help people understand each other, that would be helpful.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll follow your lead.
The first thing that I thought of when you were talking about that is the old mantra, hurt people hurt people.
Right.
And the way that I'm thinking about that is the fact that there are a lot of people who feel that they're hurt, and if you feel you're hurt, you probably are actually hurt, but because they've been sold a bill of goods, their parents and their grandparents and whomever else have sold them a bill of goods, when you hear people say, they're taking our jobs, they're taking this, they're taking that, whatever it's going to be, that ends up telling me that there's a mindset that's been passed to someone that they were born and stamped, you're going to work at that plant, you're going to work here, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. Because that's the only way that you can say, well, that's my job. If you're not working there, how is it your job? You know, you understand what I'm saying? So we end up having this privilege or this idea of privilege, a feeling of, well, but wait a minute, I am a real American, AKA I am a white, straight, Christian American, whatever it's going to be. And if we end up having privilege, but nobody talks about privilege, if we end up having supremacy and nobody talks about supremacy, then the people who have benefited from it feel like they're under attack and they feel hurt when things are done to basically unpack or undo those structures and to make things just a little more fair for the person of a different gender, a different sexuality, a different race, any of those things. And then people feel that they're hurt. And like I said, when people feel or think that they're hurt, they end up processing. You would know better than me that they're hurt. So hurt people hurt people. So I think that one of the ways that I've always engaged with students is to really begin by talking about what they want, what they desire, what they want out of life, and really talk about, you know, finding those commonalities. That most people who you talk to, they're going to want the best things for themselves, for their families, they're going to want opportunities, all of those things. So then you start to talk about how opportunities are baked into structures. And oh yeah, well, you know, I understand this. Then you say, well, what if these opportunities were less available or weren't available or some people were frozen out? Let's just say maybe because of elements of their identity. Oh, that would be terrible. Then you pull out the reality, you bring out the data. Some of the data that we saw earlier, some other data, you say, well, guess what? It's happening. And when you kind of reverse engineer it, it doesn't work for every student, but you end up having a lot of students who start to get it. Like, oh, wait a minute, I was sold a bill of goods in terms of, well, that I should have this privilege that other people don't have because it's their fault, and then you can engage in conversation. The conversation is going to go in lots of different ways with different students, but kind of starting with that common desire and then working backwards, so that would be, you know, the solution out there.
Yeah, I think Creighton is becoming more diverse, but it's still very segregated. And I've talked to students about that and said, I mean, who are your friends? Who do you talk to? And it is segregated in a very real way. And so I think talking to people and hearing their story is crucial, but doing so in a way that names what we're trying to get to, understanding, mutuality, mutual respect, I think that's really important, and changing the narrative from opposition to understanding, and doing that in a structured way. It's not just going to happen. You have to be very deliberate about naming the issue, segregation on campus. How do we overcome that? Let's have a talking session. Something like that. I mean, I don't know the details of how to make that happen, but I think it's not just going to happen, because I've seen it. I've been here 21 years and I've seen the divisions on campus, and so I think we have to be very deliberate about how we address that.
We also have to be careful to not be too prescriptive, particularly to the people who are on the margins, because a lot of times we can see what looks like segregation, and we forget that sometimes people are seeking comfort, that sometimes people are looking for community, and if the people who are looking for community happen to look like one another, you can see it, versus like all the white kids who like to play Magic the Gathering get together. Nobody's like, oh, they're segregated. It's like, well, no, they have an interest, they have a shared lived experience. Well, if your lived experience is being a black woman in Omaha at Creighton University, at some point during your day or during your week, you may want to commiserate or to have a good time and let loose with other black women who are living, so we just have to be very careful with that I guess the idea of segregation is more, we need to think of it as actively people feeling like they can't participate, that they can't succeed, all of those things because they're different, but also not disallowing them from gathering with people from time to time. Because I always used to say when I was working at Augustana, when Friday would come, I would just be like, it's black time. And everybody would laugh. And I'd even say it to some of my white colleagues, like, I'll get up with you tomorrow on Saturday, but it's Friday, it's black time. And they knew that I'd been with, having a great time with all my white colleagues all week. But on Friday, we had this place called Roosters. It was this black-owned bar, and it was just like, I gotta see some black people. It's been a long week. And everybody's there, and I'm like, hey, black people, what's up? And it wasn't like, oh, segregationist, it wasn't George Wallace. It was like, oh, Lord, I need to see some black folks. So sometimes we can be lighthearted, have a good time. Just, every once in a while, it's not always heavy. Sometimes it's just, I'm about to drink this beer and crack a few jokes, and I'll see everybody again tomorrow. So just, I guess to end on a lighter note, I would say it's not always heavy, y'all. Sometimes it's just, I need a moment.
We're scheduled to go to 8:30. I'm more than happy to stay if Chris is for a bit, but if people need to leave, feel free to do so. We won't be offended. But if people have more questions, we're happy to take those.
Do you still have a comment, sir?
Ron?
Bobby, Don,
Ron?
you have a question?
Did you have something?
People say when I talk, I wander like an old person over 80, but that's the way it is. I wander around. I think something happened involving Creighton some years ago that will have a lasting negative effect about the Catholic Church and racism. I don't think we realize the effects of closing St. Joe's Hospital. I don't think we've talked about that near enough. Lay people have said, a lot of lay people have said, it's kind of sad because that's in the area where the poor part of town is, and frankly, where the black people live. There is a clinic on 24th. Oh, that's just my oxygen. It's not important. If that goes out, I have to shut up. So if you want to turn it off. But I really think that whole thing with St. Joe's Hospital is going to have a negative effect on the image of Creighton University. It's a big deal, a lot bigger than we are willing to admit. Now, for some reason, I have been invited to a group of businessmen. Some are retired, but others are continuing in business. And it's about 8 or 10 men. And they're all graduates of Creighton Prep. And it's amazing to me how they've stuck together all these 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years. But they are, I'd say, in the upper echelon of society in this community we call Omaha. And I don't feel really a part of that group. I have nothing in common with these people. But I would venture to say that over half have graduated from this university. And I just have to say and remind ourselves together that capitalism, and this sounds like it's a far-fetched idea, but it really hits pay dirt when we realize that capitalism has sucked up these men like a vortex or whirlpool downward into materialism. And the bottom line of decisions is the dollar. And these men are very successful, and most of them are millionaires. We go out to eat. That's how I was invited to the group. And we go to country clubs, and we have wonderful meals. And I almost dread the next one because I just don't feel a part of the group. But if I would carry or wear a wire, I think I could play it here. And I think we'd be quite dumbfounded at the type of conversation. It's all about competition and the dollar, and the guy who owns part of the barge lines on the Missouri, another guy who's involved with this, and another guy who's involved with that in the city. They're very wealthy and very prominent, and it just sort of depresses me that the dollar, their position in society in Omaha, is very stable, secure. They feel proud of who they are and what they've accomplished, and I guess they have a right to. But the system that says the powerful people are the wealthy people, this leaves a lot of people out. And I would ask you to meditate on how many black or Native American, I don't even know what to call you, I'm sorry. How do you like to be referred to? I don't.
But you can call me a black man. That'll work.
Black man?
There you go. That'll work.
Is that okay?
Well, I'll just say
I'm not trying to be funny or...
You're good. You're good. Yeah.
I sure don't want to offend anybody.
No, you're all right.
But in the planning boards that made the decision to make a concrete development out of the farm grounds west of Boys Town, and now Jean Leahy Mall, to fill that hole and take away the lagoon. I don't think there are many black people on those planning boards, and I might be mistaken. Okay, so I just think that Creighton is great. I think we should be so grateful that Creighton is here, but at the same time, I don't see a lot of difference in the actual lived experience of the common professional person between Creighton graduates and others. And I feel bad to say that. I hope I'm not prejudiced about Creighton in saying that, but I just am not that impressed with the product right now.
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do all around in terms of educational institutions, political, religious, and social. So I want to thank everyone. Thanks to Chris, And thank you for being here.